Okay, so we've talked about how to write scripts in Matlab. Let's talk about how to write functions. So first, let me just pop open. Here's just a sort of example toy script. We have some comments at the top, and then just a bunch of lines of Matlab code. Okay, so the way we write functions is slightly differently. We have the same sort of comments at the top. I'm just going to put some generic information. Okay, now what's different between scripts and functions, or one of the differences, is that the first line of code in a function has to sort of be the special line, and the special line has to start with the function keyword. You'll see it turns blue in Matlab. Okay, the next thing is you have function output equals, this is the name of the function, I'm calling it my function, and then some input, right? If we wanted to have multiple inputs, you could do it this way, and so on. And the same goes for multiple outputs. So you can put the output in square brackets and have output 1, output 2, and so on. For now, let's just start with a single input and a single output. Okay, the next thing that's very important is when you save your function, the file name that you use to save the function, so here it's myfunction.m, has to be the exact same name or string as the sort of line of what you call the function in the actual code. So just keep that in mind. These two have to match. Okay. So if I change this to something else like my function xx, Matlab will actually, you can see here it's giving me a warning, which is indicated by this orange squiggly line, and it's saying function my name, or my function xx is known to Matlab by its file name my function. So it's saying the file name is my function. They don't match up. So I'm just going to fix it. So those two strings have to match up. Okay. So basically, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to say, just print out what the input is. So this is just sort of some more Matlab code. We've already talked about fprintf. The disp function just displays a certain variable. So if I have like x equals 5, I can say disp x, and it'll just print out that variable. And it works regardless of if x is a string or a number. It doesn't matter. Okay, so I'm just going to display whatever the input is, and then I'm going to say the output is going to be a random number, and I'm just going to here, let me scoot this over a little. And I'm going to say output equals rand n. I'm just going to generate a normal random number and save as the output. Okay. So the way you call functions in Matlab is sort of slightly different from scripts. So just to show you, right, so for a script we can just call like, from the command window, and you can see here I'm plotting the sine function. So that's how you call scripts. So functions work similarly, except I can't just call my function because it'll say that there's not enough input arguments because we didn't pass it an input variable. So let's try my function of 10. You'll see the output is 10. The output is going to be a random number, and it prints out the output of the function, which is this random number. Additionally, I can say I can store the output as a variable, and then now I can say the input is 10, the output is going to be a random number, and now that random number is stored in this variable called output. So I can I have that variable now in my workspace. Okay, so the big difference, so this is just sort of a cartoon example, but the big difference between functions, here I'll just show you with a string, my input, right? The input is my input, the output is going to be a random number. Okay, anyways, the big difference between scripts and functions is that functions do not have access to your global workspace. So your workspace over here that you see in the Matlab desktop is what's called a global workspace. So scripts have access to this global workspace. So for example, if I run this script, I'm not actually passing it any information. It's just sort of going to generate these values and plot it for me, right? So scripts have both read and write access to the global workspace. What I mean by that is this script can sort of read any values in the workspace, and it can write values to the workspace. So let's say, for example, I go in my script and comment out these two lines, right? And I'm going to change y here to be, let's say, a completely different function. Oops. It doesn't matter what I chose to make y. It's just some random data. But the point is, I'm going to run this script, and this script isn't going to actually run these lines of code because they're commented out. Instead, we're just going to plot x comma y, right? And you'll notice that it generates the plot of x comma y. Y here is just sort of this random noisy data. And so you'll notice that it had access to x and y even though I never actually defined what x and y were in this script. That's because they were already defined in my workspace, right? Additionally, I can say y equals 0 here and run the script either by hitting the run button or by typing it. I'll just hit the run button this time. Right here, I ran it again, but you'll notice this time it set the output of y to 0, right? Sort of what you expected. But you can imagine there's cases where you want to run, say, some code that someone else in your lab wrote or that you found online to do something, and you don't want that code to have access to your workspace because you might have sensitive data in here, and you might have named it by a variable name that they also happen to use in their code, and so you don't want them to be able to either overwrite or read the data you have, right? So that's where functions come in. So the idea behind functions is functions do not have access to this workspace. So to show you that, let's say I have an input here which is 1, 2, 3, 4, just a string, and I say my function, right? What's going to happen is it's going to say not enough input arguments, even though the input exists in my workspace. In order for my function to see that input, I have to explicitly pass it to the function, right? And so when I give it to it in parentheses, it sees that information, right? Another example is, let's say I happen to also have a variable called output, which was some very important numbers in my workspace, right? If I call my function of input and I don't have anything to the left of the function name, it won't get to overwrite what my output variable is, right? Instead, it stores the output in this sort of temporary variable called ANS, which stands for answer, but it didn't get to access this output variable. Instead, I get to choose what I call this output variable. So here I'm going to call it function output, and it's going to store the output in this function output variable, and it doesn't touch my output variable, right? So the names that are used in this function and the names of my workspace are completely separated from one another. For example, I could say, instead of my function output equals my function input, I could say function output equals my function on x, where if I'm just going to define what x is, 5, right? X is 5. Now I'm going to say function output equals my function x, right? So here, what's happening is this x is going to get mapped to this input variable. The function is going to get run. It's going to store some output here, and that's going to get mapped to this function output. So, and you can see that here, right? The function output, the input is whatever the value of x was. Okay, so the whole point of this sort of silly script, or silly function, which isn't actually useful, but it's just to show you the idea behind passing data to functions and sort of encapsulating it or keeping it separate from your global workspace so it can't contaminate your workspace variables. So that's the idea behind functions. Another place where functions become useful is, so say for example you're running a function or running the same sort of lines of code over and over again. Oftentimes it's useful to put that code in a function, and you can just sort of call the function over and over again. And then the last thing I wanted to mention about functions is, so you'll recall the help command in Matlab. Oh wow. Okay, so the help command also works with any custom functions that you write. So if I say help my function, it'll actually print out the first few lines of code in my function, right? Additionally, if I say help to my script, it'll actually work for scripts too. It'll print out these first few lines of code, right? As soon as you have a space or a gap, it'll stop printing out those comments in help. Okay, so that's it for functions.